All right, so this is probably going to be a relatively short video that's going to wind up our stuff on the Byzantine Empire. So we're going to talk today about the late Byzantine Empire and its eventual collapse. So some of the things that we brought up in our previous video about how the Byzantines managed to kind of stabilize themselves after the early shock of a lot of defeats against the Caliphate. Those things eventually turned out to be not so great for the Byzantine Empire. So, one of the reasons why the Byzantines started to decline, so let's talk about the decline of the Byzantines. One of the reasons that the Byzantine Empire started to decline was that the theme system started to fail. So, if you remember back to the previous video we did, the theme system was this system of giving peasants land in return for military service. And so the idea was that the peasants would get land that would keep them happy and well fed and give them some money. In return, they would serve in the military, and then the peasants would have a reason to fight for the Byzantine Empire because they're a stakeholder in the Byzantine Empire. They have a reason to defend their own territory because they own a piece of it. And so they're defending their family and they're defending their neighbors. So they have a reason to want to serve in the military. So we get a strong, dedicated military because they have an investment in the survival of the Byzantine Empire. But starting around the 1100s and then moving forward, peasants started selling the land they were given. You know, it was their land to do what they wanted to with, but starting in the 1100s, they started selling it. This probably coincides with an economic downturn, and the peasants needed money. So they started selling the land that they got in the theme system. Which, you know, is fine. They made some money, but what it does is it actually does two things that are going to hurt the Byzantine Empire. One, it's going to make the military less dedicated. We're back to where we started. Because now the soldiers are fighting for nothing. They don't have a stake in the system anymore. So the soldiers don't really care what happens anymore. It's also going to, in the long run, make people more rebellious because they have less money and less food. And all this is doing is increasing the gap between rich and poor. And we know that wherever we see that, rebellion and decline are not far behind. So wherever we see this increase between or this increase in the gap between the rich and the poor, that usually ends up giving us rebellion and decline because the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Now, in this case, it's kind of the poor people's fault because they're the ones who sold the land that they were given, but it doesn't really matter. If the gap between rich and poor grows, you're going to get rebellions. Now, coinciding with this, as the theme system starts to fail, the Byzantines come under renewed attacks from both east and west. So they're getting attacked on two fronts. So from the west, we can knock this out pretty quickly. From the western side, kind of attacking Italy and Greece, are these guys called Normans. And the Normans are the descendants of the Vikings who settled in the Mediterranean. And so in the West, the Byzantines are getting attacked from these guys, and they're losing a lot of territory in Europe. On the other side, from the east, the Abbasid Caliphate starts attacking again. Now, the reason for this is a little too dense for what we need to understand here, but basically what happened was there was an internal power shift at the top of the government, at the top of the caliphate. And one of these Turkic people, these people are called the Seljuk Turks, take over the caliphate. And when they take over the caliphate, they start attacking a lot. They go to war. The Seljuk Turks were very militaristic, and as soon as they are in charge of the caliphate, they decide they're going to turn the Abbasid Caliphate back into a conquest machine, and they go to war. And the nearest people are the Byzantines. It really doesn't matter who it is they're fighting. They really just want to be fighting somebody. And unfortunately, it turns out to be the Byzantines. So what we've got here is a system in which the military itself is starting to fail. The people are unhappy with the government. They're more likely to rebel. And they're being attacked on both sides. And there's even evidence that when the Abbasids came into Byzantine territory, they were often really excited to see the Muslims show up because they were so sick and tired of the ineffective Byzantine leadership. So people in the Byzantine Empire were kind of excited to see the Abbasids show up because they'd rather be governed by people who knew what they were doing rather than the Byzantines who were, quite frankly, falling on their faces at the moment. this stuff with the invasion of the Muslims, this is what's going to lead to the Crusades. And we're going to do a separate video about the Crusades in this sequence on Europe. So this stuff about the Islamic Caliphate invading the Byzantine Empire, that is one of the triggers for the Crusades. So we're going to cover this in depth in a video of its own. So we're going to cover that one on its own in the coming days. Two more things that we need to bring up when we talk about why the Byzantine Empire started to decline is one of these crusades. The Fourth Crusade. So there were a series of crusades. There were 7 official crusades. The fourth one is the one we need to mention here. Remember, we're not going to go into a lot of depth here because we're going to cover this in its entirety in a separate video. But the Fourth Crusade, which took place from 1202 to 1204, it sacked Constantinople. So Constantinople was basically destroyed and kind of everything was stolen. So they were stolen from, and they never really recovered. This marks kind of the end of Constantinople as being a really important Christian city. But don't worry, we were going to talk all about the Fourth Crusade in an upcoming video. So we're going to cover the Crusades, but we can't really talk about why the Byzantine Empire declined without talking about the Fourth Crusade. So I'm just putting it in here as a placeholder so that when we actually talk about the Crusades, it'll make sense. So we'll cover this in its time, in its entirety when we get there. The last big reason why we see a decline in the Byzantine Empire is the growth of the Italian economy. Now, remember that we said that the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines kind of linked Western Europe to the rest of the world. So anything coming in and out of Western Europe kind of came in and out through the Byzantine Empire, and specifically Constantinople. However, starting around the 1100s, Italian city-states begin to grow economically. And they start to serve the same purpose that Constantinople used to. So what are these city-states? Maybe the most important one is Venice, but there's also Florence, Milan, Genoa. Notice that we're not mentioning Rome. Rome is kind of its own separate thing, and we'll talk about Rome separately because that's where the Pope lives. The Pope lives in Rome, and it's not following the same path that the rest of Italy is. So the Pope is kind of doing his own thing in Rome. But these cities start to do the same thing that Constantinople did. So as these cities grow, Constantinople declines. It's also not a coincidence that the Fourth Crusade that sacked Constantinople, the guys that did this, the soldiers that sacked Constantinople, were largely from Venice. So if they weren't from Venice, they got to Constantinople from Venice. So the fact that it was sacked by one of their rivals is not a coincidence. So all of these things put together, the decline of the theme system, the new attacks from both East and West, the Fourth Crusade, the growth of Italian economies causing the Byzantine economy to start to shrink. All of these things put together make for a very easy empire to topple over. And there were a series of just devastating battles that the Byzantines lost. So they lost almost every important battle. From about 1000 to their eventual demise in 1453. So maybe the battle that's most important that nobody knows anything about is the Battle of Manzakurt. So this was still when the Byzantine Empire was kind of moving along nicely. Here they lost to the Seljuk Turks. And the Seljuk Turks now controlled most of Anatolia, which was the Byzantine heartland, and it's what is now modern Turkey. They lost that siege of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. So 1202 to 1204. And then finally, another group of Turkish people, the Ottoman Turks, captured Constantinople itself, and they took it as their capital. By this point, by 1453, pretty much all that was left of the Byzantine Empire was the city of Constantinople. So the Ottoman Turks captured it in 1453, and it was made the capital of the new Ottoman Empire. And then eventually, is renamed Istanbul. So if you went to Istanbul, it used to be Constantinople. So Istanbul is one of these like really, really old cities. And you can still visit all of the old Byzantine buildings. Like the Hagia Sophia is still there. It's now a museum. It was a mosque. I think it might be a mosque again right now. I think the news is reporting that they are in the process of turning this mosque, which was a museum, back into a mosque. But you could still go visit the Hagia Sophia. You can go visit the place where the Nika riots started. So Istanbul is essentially all of the architecture of the Byzantine Empire is still there in Constantinople if you go to visit Istanbul. So the Byzantine Empire had a long run, and remember, this is a continuation of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire collapses in 476. The Byzantine Empire goes for about another 1,000 years, continuing a lot of these Roman ideas until they are eventually taken over by another group of Turkic people, the Ottoman Turks, in 1453. So that's the end of the Byzantine Empire. Our next video, we're going to now shift gears and look to the west and see what was going on in Western Europe. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.